I'd like to welcome the audience today to today's topic of 10 best payer contracting practices for 2019. I enjoy doing these sessions. I usually do them about twice a year as things evolve in the payer contracting space and as we detect new trends. So each time we do one of these sessions, even if you've been along for the ride before, I try to infuse it with new material that will be helpful to you in your companies or your practice. Today we have a terrific turnout of a wide variety of different providers and companies. We have medical practices, we have ambulatory surgery centers, behavioral health companies, a variety of ancillary providers and companies, including DME companies, laboratories, various specialty providers, and a whole range of different practice types that are joining us today. So very excited to have the opportunity to talk with you. I would like to also introduce my colleague who will be your MC for today. That would be Nicole Medina, who is a Healthcents payer contracting client executive. So Nicole, welcome on board.
Thank you, Steve. Happy to be here.
Yes, and Nicole will be fielding your questions, which I will explain in just a moment. So welcome to today's session. So first off, just to give those who are perhaps not as familiar with Healthcents a little bit of background about our business. We are a company that specializes in payer contracting nationally. In fact, the largest national company that does payer contracting, and we represent a broad range of providers, including medical practices, ambulatory surgery centers, ancillary providers, specialty hospitals, DME companies, you name it. So we have been doing payer contracting since 1994, so I think it's reasonable to say that we've stood the test of time, having been in business for that duration of time. We also have done a number of specialized consulting engagements for companies, including and organizations, including the American Urological Association, Staples, Inc., their Quill Healthcare Division, and many others. We also have a variety of spokes off of our hub of payer contract, including claims analysis, credentialing services, and helping our clients. And we even have some clients who do nothing but online marketing and traditional marketing of their products and services, which of course goes hand in glove with getting contracts that then attracting clients to your business. We have a software product called Revolution Software, which is used to assess payer fee schedules and compare them and do detailed analytics. Also the only known cloud service of its kind for doing payer contracting analytics. And we also do custom education and training offerings, including a recorded 6-part, 8-hour plus blueprint for success payer contracting training, which does a lot of what we do in this 1 hour in a lot more detail, basically teaching providers the tricks of the trade, so to speak, about how to negotiate payer contracts. So really excited to have the opportunity to work with you today a little bit and to have an opportunity to educate a little bit about payer contracting. My goal is always to send you away with usable material that you can take back to your practice or companies and put to work right away. So we'll make the most of our hour and a half or so session today. That's a little bit about my background. In a prior life, I also was a software and business development executive at a little company called IBM. So I ran all of their business intelligence, which are analytical products, software development, and business development for that company, and have been doing payer contracting now since 2002, and I estimate I've negotiated 40,000 plus payer contracts across every provider type that you can imagine. So a lot of experience in this field. My colleague, Nicole Medina, spends her days and nights, sometimes late at night, often late at night, doing payer contracting as well, and really serving the needs of our clients. That's a little bit about our company and a little bit about my background in the calls. Now, for today's session, we are going to have different break points where we'll have an opportunity for question and answer and for interaction. I love to have interactions and encourage it. So I will deliberately take pauses in 2 or 3 different places throughout the session. And there's a couple of ways that you can participate depending on your preference. You may ask a live question when I do these pauses, and I will remind you at the time that we do the pauses that all you need to do to ask a live question is press *6 on your phone and simply ask your question. And then when we're done conversing, if you would please press *6 again, I'd appreciate it. That will just mute your line. So asking live questions, *6, or starting right now, any question that might pop into your mind through stream of consciousness, anything you're thinking you'd like to discuss with us or ask about, or as we present a slide or a concept, if you would like to ask a question, just simply send an email to the email ID question@healthcents.com. That would be question@healthcents.com. Nicole will be monitoring throughout the session questions that come in so that when we do the different breaks, you'll have an opportunity through this email process of just sending emails to question@healthcents.com. She will pick up your questions and ask as many of them as we can possibly cover in the time allotted. So we get a lot of questions. We will try to answer as many as we possibly can in the short time that we have together. So again, we welcome participation. By the way, one of the questions I often get at the front end of these webinars that I'm going to answer right now, so you don't have to worry about it or ask about it later, is how do you get copies of the slides for this actual webinar? And the answer is, following the session, we will, at the end of the session, provide you with the information and a link about how to go about getting a copy of the slides, and also how to go about getting a complete recorded version of this webinar, which should be available as soon as tomorrow morning. There is at the same link that I'll provide you, there is a recorded version of a prior session, but that will be replaced by the morning. So anyway, welcome once again on board. Now, without further ado, I will jump into today's topic and provide a perspective about payer contracting. Now, we all, in running our companies and practices, deal with operational practices on the left: scheduling, coding, billing, collections, cash flow, patient or customer account management, and so forth. What we often don't focus on as much is the opportunity to expand our company or practice by either putting in place new payer contracts or potentially renegotiating our existing payer contracts. So when we think about revenue cycle, I'd like to have you think about this important puzzle piece of payer contracting as an opportunity, in addition to maximizing and optimizing your revenue cycle and practice management processes. Consider payer contracting to be a key part of that and a key way to maximize revenue. That's what this is all about. So today's agenda is we're going to dive right in and go through what we call the 10 best payer contracting practices. They are really just 10 sequential steps broken into 3 discrete areas that are meant to be a proven process for you to successfully contract and renegotiate contracts with payers. The 3 discrete areas that they fit into, as you will see in just a moment, are preparing for negotiations, and then completing and iterating actual payer contract negotiations, so the actual negotiations process, and then the monitoring aspect of contracts, often the forgotten step, and that is making sure that you're being paid according to the contracted rates that you have put in place with the various payers that you have negotiated with. So those three areas of preparation, negotiation, and monitoring are basically how the 10 steps ultimately are grouped is into those three areas, and they are meant to be sequential steps. So you'll walk away with a formula, if you will, and a sequential way to go about negotiating your payer contracts. Second, we're going to do some evaluation of reimbursements and analysis, show you different ways of doing effective analysis, and particularly hone in on the fact that we should be weighting reimbursement based upon the revenue contribution of the codes and services that are being assessed and contracted. We're going to do a little bit of SWOT analysis, that's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, about how we go about preparing properly for a negotiation and positioning ourselves as a provider of medical services and products to a payer for consideration for inclusion in their networks or to potentially get an increase over current reimbursement. So there are specific techniques and items that we're going to want to highlight in order to do that properly and to get the payer's attention. And then we're going to talk about how to put together effective proposal letters. I'm going to give you a little template that you can walk away with and actually construct your own letters, the handling of payer objections, and highlight some of the key payer contracting operational language constructs to look out for in payer contracts. That's a whole topic unto itself. We literally have a template of about 25 different operational language constructs in addition to the actual rates of a payer contract agreement that we look out for in areas such as claims payment, term and termination, general items even related to insurance and liability, things of that nature. Our intention is not to do a legal assessment here, but rather to give you some pragmatic things to look for in payer contracts that can affect the speed at which you're able to bill and collect on payments and the accuracy of those payments and things like that, making sure that contracts, once you put them in place, work. We're going to do a little bit in the way of monitoring claims payments and show you ways you can go about auditing your claims payments. We're going to talk about closed and narrow networks. That's a big topic today, is how do I get into a payer's network if it's closed and if they're not accepting new providers of my type, how do I get in? So we're going to give you some suggestions. While there isn't any one silver bullet, there are certainly approaches, proven approaches that we implement every day that help break down these sorts of obstacles and give you a shot at getting into payers' networks that are actually closed or perhaps narrow. The only distinction there being that the network maybe has a small number of providers of your type, and generally the payer isn't looking to accept new providers, but with a good reason to make an exception, they will. So that's the distinction about narrow networks. Time permitting, I'll prioritize questions and answers, but time permitting, we'll do a little bit on trends and directions and then wrap up. This continues to be a very rapidly evolving landscape. I'm sure with the elections now behind us, at least the midterms, that probably will stimulate a whole other set of changes that we'll see the next 6 months as the outcome of the election takes effect. Often those cycles do produce changes that begin to present themselves in the context of payer contracts negotiations. So we try to anticipate trends. This is obviously not a political forum. You have plenty of those, probably more than any of us can tolerate at any one point in time. But the point here is to make sure that we, as much as possible, are proactive about where the environment is headed, the general direction, and have a way to respond to it. Now, as far as this is a practice revenue chart, but it kind of shows what we often see when we deal with medical practices in particular, that over half of the contracts are often Medicare, Medicaid related, about 40% commercial, and then some out of network. So can't do much to help you on the Medicare, Medicaid, but can certainly help with almost the other half of the equation here, and that's the commercial contracts and perhaps turning some of those out-of-network situations where it makes sense into in-network opportunities. So the three areas that I mentioned that the 10 steps fit into is preparation, negotiation, and monitoring of contracts. So what I'd like to do at this point is cover the key steps at each stage, and then we'll kind of pause a little bit for some interaction at that point, and then move on from there into some of the other topics about today's session. So between preparation and negotiation, the first point I want to mention to you is very important that you spend the time up front to prepare for a negotiation, and that includes doing your fee schedule assessments, making sure you know which codes and services are going to be most important to you to calibrate in terms of pricing. When you're doing a payer contract, make sure that you know your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, so that when you're talking to a payer, you can talk to a payer in terms they understand. And being insurance companies, the terms they understand are things like clinical benefits that are going to save them money versus longer inpatient stay days, things of that nature. So payers are very, oriented towards, if I contract with a particular provider or company, is it going to save me downstream money when that I could otherwise avoid having to spend if I go down this path of contracting with you as a provider, or am I best off giving a small increase as compared to, moving cases over to hospital, things like that. So that preparation and really understanding how you're going to go about the negotiation is very, very critical, and often not enough time is spent thinking through those items, and instead people launch into negotiations without really having the right strategy in place. That's a little bit like invoking on a sporting event or participating in a team sport without having a game plan. It tends to not work out so well. And then monitoring, as I mentioned, it's the forgotten step, but we're going to want to make sure that we do some degree of auditing when it comes to payments against contracted rates to be sure that indeed we are getting compensated at the right rates. So the steps graphically look something like this, where we have phase 1 of preparation, a phase 2 of negotiation, and a phase 3 of monitoring. And in this context, we want to do our data analysis, proposal letter preparation, making initial contact with the payer, all as part of the preparation phase. Do all that before we invoke in a negotiation with a payer, and then we have this iterative process where we're going to send a proposal to a payer. We're going to put the payer on the hook to get back to us in a reasonable period of time, usually about 3 weeks from the date that we send the letter out. We're going to build a relationship with the payer to answer any questions that they might have in the early stages, and make sure that they acknowledge who we are, and that we're going to get some sort of a reply one way or the other from the payer. And by the way, some reply, even if it's a negative reply, is better than no reply at all, because a negative reply then gives us an opportunity to take the next step, which is escalating to senior management to make the case to get the increase or to get into the payer's network, and then finally monitoring the payments via EOBs or claims, and then renegotiating agreements once that time window has expired. Today we see contracts that are sometimes evergreen contracts where they renew once a year with a certain amount of notification required. Maybe it's 90 days prior to the anniversary date, for example, of a payer contract. And if it renews once a year in that manner, then it's often an evergreen scenario where if you miss that notification period to renegotiate rates and so forth, it's going to automatically renew. There are other agreements where it might be locked in for 3+ years already, in which case, the opportunity, obviously, to negotiate is likely to not be there till you get about 2.5 years into the agreement from the commencement date, so that you can meet any notification requirements on a long-term agreement. So it's important to monitor the term of these agreements to know at which juncture to actually go in and do a negotiation. It's one of the common problems that we see sometimes when we're supporting a client is they'll give us a portfolio of 8 or 10 contracts to negotiate, and then when we look at the contracts, we find that 2 or 3 of them were just signed 3 or 4 months ago and are locked in long term. Not to say it's 100% impossible to negotiate a contract like that, but it's a much steeper hill to climb without a doubt, because there's much less incentive when 2 parties are locked into a long-term agreement to renegotiate it at that point. So very important to kind of know where you stand on the lock of different agreements. So the 10 steps, I distill then into a narrative here in the same way that we just looked at them graphically. So I'll leave you, with this more in the slide deck, but the preparation stage with the first 5 steps, which include the assessment of the top codes and the prioritization of the codes based on revenue, the benchmarking relative to Medicare rates, and we also have different techniques where you can actually benchmark an agreement against an aggregate of your other agreements to determine which ones are above your overall aggregate reimbursement by code, and in total, which ones are below, and make some logical assessments about which agreements to go after and which codes or code groups. Often we're dealing with a large portfolio, let's say of a multi-specialty practice. We might distill the codes into categories like surgical codes, E&M codes, labs and pathology and so forth, and in order to get a better feeling for whether or not there's certain trending going on where parts of the fee schedule may be low in relation to other parts of the fee schedule. So these are all, the kinds of things that you do up front during a benchmarking phase. Then the SWOT analysis, both of the fee schedules, which would have to do with, looking at codes and code groupings like we're talking about, but also then the positioning of the company or practice relative to others that are already in a payer's network or that you're competing with in your area, preparing the proposal letter. Then the blocking and tackling, which is really what we're talking about here, is very, very time consuming. That's one of the reasons that that companies choose to outsource this function to a company like ours is, really does take a lot of manpower and just a lot of phone calls and email follow-ups and so on to make sure that a payer is, looking at your proposals, is responding to your proposals, and, really has to happen on a frequent basis, sometimes, 2 or 3 times a week, but at least once a week in the early stages, and perhaps more as you get into counter proposals and going back and forth with a payer. And also figuring out, once you're at the point where you get a response from a payer, if you hear a no, thinking about ways of navigating that no. We often say that if we're hearing no from the first level negotiator, we just haven't talked to the right person. yet, because if we have the right proposition, then there's no reason why a payer won't consider the proposal. It may be just at the lower levels of the organization, they're handed a rule book that indicates that they should turn down any new proposals, that sort of thing, and it may require an escalation. Now, one of the things that happens is sometimes a company or practice will see something objectionable in contract language and want to start negotiating language or involving their legal counsel up front when it comes to contract language changes. That's one of the practices that I very much discourage, and our team has certainly been taught not to do, is you want to keep the focus in the early part of the negotiation on the thing that matters most, which is going to be the reimbursement terms surrounding the agreement. And then if there really is something in the contract language that's objectionable, it's best to handle that on the back end. And that's why we made it best practice 9 and not best practice 1 or 2. And then best practice 10 is monitoring payments to make sure that your reimbursement, what you're actually being paid, is commensurate with the contracted rate, which usually has 2 components: the amount that is due from the health insurance company, the payer, and then the amount that is due from the patient or customer. So the reimbursement of those 2 components needs to be tracked relative to the contracted rate to make sure that if they don't match, that you fully understand the reason. And there can be reasons where you don't realize it, but you may even be responsible. For instance, there's a construct in almost every payer contract which indicates you could pay the lesser bill charge or the contracted rate. Well, you set let's say you have an E&M code of 99213, and the bill charge is $90, and the contracted rate is $100. Well, the problem there is that you can end up getting paid the $90 because embedded in that payer contract is that clause that says you get paid the lesser the bill charge or the contracted rate. So what you don't want to happen is that, your charge master doesn't get touched for 5 or 10 years, and then because of that and inflationary scenarios, you end up getting under reimbursed. So that's the reason why you want to check things out and make sure that you're being paid correctly. So with that as a backdrop, Nicole, I think this is an excellent time to pause and take questions. So I guess the first thing that I'll do at this point for those that would like to ask questions is I will go ahead and unmute the line, and I'll explain then how you go about asking a question. So give me just one moment to do that. Okay, at this time, for anybody that would like to ask a live question right here, right now, please press *6 on your phone and ask the question. If there are any live questions, please press *6 on your phone and ask a question right now. I'll be happy to converse with you. Any live questions? All right. Well, that being the case, Nicole, I know we've been also not uncommon in these sessions that people tend to use our question at Healthcents.com as the primary vehicle for asking questions. Do we have any questions that might have come in? And if so, fire away.
Okay, yes, Steve, we do have a couple questions that came in. So the first one is, how do you handle carriers like Blue Cross Blue Shield who say they have a statewide fee schedule and all physicians are paid the same and they do not negotiate?
Okay, great question. So the standard statewide fee schedule for a particular carrier, which, many of them, maybe almost all, have. This is going to get down to the scenario where, as a practice or as a company providing services in the area, the first thing you're going to want to look at is, do you have any unique products or services as compared to others that are in the network? So, for example, for medical practice, one scenario that occurs to me that worked pretty nicely in a particular geography in the mid part of our country is, at the time we had a urology practice that was using a robot called the Da Vinci robot for doing prostate surgeries, and at that time the outcomes that were being achieved as a result of using that robotic technique for certain kinds of prostate cancer related surgeries was producing better surgical outcomes, and as a result we were able to quantify that each patient, was spending a certain amount of time less in a hospital, and let's just say, I don't remember exactly what the time frame was, but let's say it was 2 weeks less. Well, it's 2 weeks less at $1,500 a day. Then you start multiplying it out across 100 patients, and that's a lot of savings for a payer. So those sorts of things can be used to overcome a standard fee schedule and have an exception made. There can be other things too. I mean, if you're fortunate enough to be a biggest, best only of your type of practice, for example, in a rural area, then the payer is up against licensing issues where they're going to need to have you in their network, and they're likely to want to play ball because of the influence and the fact that key employers who are their biggest customers in the area are going to want you to remain in the network and so forth. So the biggest, best only, if you have that proposition, can be important. If you're not a practice, let's say, and you're, for instance, a DME company, maybe you have a unique device, like one that comes to mind that I thought was really impressive and certainly was interesting to a lot of payers. And I know, Nicole, you worked on this particular one. Is we had a client with a special diabetic foot ulcer boot, and there were all kinds of medical statistics, and they had worked collaboratively with certain payers where they were able to demonstrate that patients with diabetic foot ulcers that were using this particular product were able to save limbs, and also even if it were a matter of not a limb being at stake, but just to treat the diabetic foot ulcer, it was saving surgeries, which are an order of magnitude more expensive. So the payer was interested then to have that company contracted in the network. Now it's a case where it was used to get them in the network. In the case of the practice, getting an increase, based on the use of the Da Vinci robot, that was a different proposition. The biggest, best only, the geography advantages of being the only one in a geography that is handling certain patient populations, or even in rural areas. All of those kinds of things can be reasons for a payer to reward. Now, there are other cases where if you're, for instance, an ambulatory surgery center, there's an inherent reason for payers to break down obstacles on increases there, because if you're one of a small number of multi-specialty surgery centers, for example, in a particular area, then if you don't get a reasonable increase and you can't service those patients, they're going to end up receiving those same outpatient services in a hospital setting, typically at 3 to 6 times more money than they would have cost in the surgery centers. The payers are usually willing to play ball there. So a whole variety of different different approaches, and I thought I'd go into it from different angles here, so you get a feel for how the obstacle to a standard fee schedule, or for that matter to closed network, if that's the scenario, can be broken down. So good question. Thanks for asking that one. What's the next one you might have there, Nicole?
We have another question. Does this apply to chiropractic contracts also?
Yeah, I mean, it can apply to chiropractic contracts, but, chiropractic contracts in general are going to be more difficult than some of the other specialties, to be candid about it. So, any other? Maybe one more.
Okay, we do have one more. How do you handle responses from carriers that they will not give an increase because the group is paid in line with other similar professional providers in the area?
Well, you'd have to, in that case, if they're telling you that it's in line with other similar practices, this is where, or service companies, if you're a DME company, this is where you would have to assess whether or not your company or practice actually is different. And this is why that preparation stage is so important. If in fact it's true, if you're one of 10 different urology practices in an urban area within a small radius, and you essentially provide the same services as the rest, then that's probably going to be the case. You're probably not going to be very successful. But if you're performing services that are unique, delivering products that are unique, doing something different. For example, we had a DME company that was selling one of our larger clients, a national client that sells CPAP masks throughout the country, and they were deploying they do deploy respiratory therapists door to door to custom fit the masks. And because of that, they can demonstrate better compliance, therefore reduce hypertension. Well, that's different. That's not the same as maybe another DME company selling exactly the same products, because they're using a key differentiator of service and custom fit, making sure customers are using the product right versus just drop shipping it and relying on the customer to figure out how to do it right, which doesn't work as well and produces worse outcomes. So I think at the end of the day, that's what really is the heart of the matter, is we have to figure out what is unique about our company or practice or about the services or products that we deliver as ancillary providers compared to our competition, who may be in the payer's network, to demonstrate to the payer that it's worth paying us a little bit more or having us in the network to provide better products or services compared to our competition. So there needs to be differentiation. If we can't come up with differentiation, it's going to be very difficult in turn to to sell a payer on what the benefits are to the payer to give us the increase or to include us in the network. And that's why I had to be, straight up and honest about the chiropractic scenario that, for instance, that would be a tougher one unless there's really something unique going on in that practice compared to what other chiropractors might be doing. So we'd have to kind of get into the weeds there and figure out if that were the case or not. But yes, the payer does need to be given a reason, and that reason needs to translate to downstream surgical savings, better patient treatment, clinical benefits, saving inpatient stay days, all of those, kinds of things that ultimately, are going to be good for the payer as well as good for you as a provider, and they're going to be different than whomever it is you may be competing with. All right. We will definitely keep going with the questions in just a few minutes. I just want to get a few more ideas out there that I think are going to be useful to the entire group that's on the call today. Now, in terms of the best practices, so I mentioned there's 10 best practices. This is the analytical part of it, and I won't, take you too deep in the weeds. I just want to make a couple of key points here about analytics when it comes to payer contracting. This is just an excerpt, an extract, a picture from our Revolution software product where we use to analyze payer contracts fee schedules. And the point that I'd like to make is a couple things. Number one is you typically will want to pick off codes or services that represent 80+% of your revenue. So it's usually like a 20-80 rule. What are the top 20% of your codes that are driving 80+% of your revenue? And let's focus on making sure that those codes are the ones that are moved up. And it can often be, negotiation point. For example, if you're dealing with ASC groupers and there's 10 groupers, but 80% of your revenue is in 2 of the 10 groupers 1 and 2, then we're going to spend our time trying to negotiate groupers 1 and 2, and we'll either keep the others the same or maybe even use them as leverage and agree to take less than a couple other groupers to get what we need in the groupers that our codes fall into. So focusing on top codes is critical. The other is, you can see in this report towards the middle here, there's a column that talks about revenue. You're typically going to sort your codes by revenue so that the top revenue producing codes come to the top of the picture. And then the other thing you're going to focus on is, if you notice down at the bottom, there's a summary table, and you can see the statistics at the top as well. And by the way, this is just, a few of there were many, many more codes in this report. We just took an extract of the first part of the report just for illustrative purposes. But what we do is we look at an average percent of Medicare where we have Medicare rates, as opposed we use weighted averages as opposed to just averages. And the difference being that an average, of course, is just going to take a collection of rates. Like here we have whatever it is, 6 rates, and we could add them all up and divide by 6, and we get we get an average. Well, that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about doing instead is doing a weighted average. So we'll take the percent Medicare, and what we'll do is we'll take the volume times the rate of reimbursement. So here we take 216, we multiply it by the payer rate, then we add to it 85 plus the next one. So we take the sum of the volumes times the payer rates, make that the numerator of the equation. Then we take the sum of the volumes times the Medicare rates for those same codes, make that the denominator, divide the 2 up, we get a weighted average. And the interesting thing that I've noticed time and time again is that weighted average rates, in other words, when you weight a code based on its importance to you, its relative importance in terms of revenue contribution, that when you calculate an average in this manner, the weighted average, it will typically be lower than when you just average up all the Medicare percentages and just divide by the number of instances that you have. And that's because the payers are pretty smart about figuring out the way the fee schedules are laid out and which codes to skew on the higher end of the spectrum. So you would expect that if they're doing their jobs well, that the average of all codes in a fee schedule, particularly when you look across 200-300 codes, is going to be higher than the weighted average based on the actual workflow through the company or practice. But on the other hand, when you're on the provider end of the spectrum, it's the weighted average that matters, because that's where the 20% of the codes that are driving 80% of your revenue, that's going to be reflected in a weighted average calculation, because that's what the weighted average is designed to do. So my point today is, even if you don't quite get the methodology just yet, what you want to do is you want to focus on weighted average reimbursement when you're calculating your reimbursement, as opposed to straight averages, because the weighted average is going to take into account the workflow through your company or practice. So this whole area of payer contracting analytics and focusing on the right things is very critical. So in this chart set, you'll have an example, a real simple example using an old code that is now a G code, a 77418, a 99213, and it'll go through the arithmetic of showing you basically how you calculate weighted average reimbursement. So the thing we want to leave you with today is focus on those weighted averages. And some more information, again, laid out to give you those calculations. Now, one of the things that has come up in today's environment quite frequently is companies or practices that merge with each other and how to deal with fee schedules in the context of a merger. So I put a question together here basically about mergers. And for the purpose of today, the idea is to demonstrate that when you get into a merger situation, what you're trying to do here is to make sure that the decisions that you make relative to a negotiation post-merger are going to be in the best interest of the combined company or practice, even though it may suboptimize one of the entities, the tax IDs that came together in the merger. I spoke at length about this a couple of years ago at the Large Urology Group Practice Association. Actually teamed up with an attorney in this area where she and I talked a lot about the sharing of information, of fee schedules, the calculations. She talked about what to look out for from a legal perspective. It's a whole topic unto itself. But the thing I want to have you walk away with here is if you look at this, simple example that says, look, we made $1 million in one company or practice prior to the merger, and we made $200,000 in another. The punchline here is that if you get an offer that would go up 8% on $1 million, even though it's going down 12% on $200K, the point is that you're better off because of the influence of that $1 million company. You're better off accepting that fee schedule compared to had you left the company standalone. Naturally, company B would be very unhappy going down what amounts to 12% of Medicare. They're not going to be happy, or 10%. They're not going to be happy if they were standalone, but they're not standalone. They're now part of a combined entity. So you want to look at the cumulative effect of the organization. You also have to think about rewards. I actually dealt with this at one point in the state of Arizona, a merged entity, and they hadn't really thought through how the structure was going to be for rewards based on payer contracts, how it was going to be doled out across the, in that case, it was physicians in a large merged practice. And it was very frustrating because the practice B, or the company B, was getting the short end of the stick. And, instead of doing some sort of allocation where, they took the incremental revenue, where they took, in this case, the $60K or whatever that came out of the net increase and allocated it, somehow the smaller of the entities that was getting less was getting the short end of that stick. So need to think through the bonus and reward structure too in these merger scenarios. So yes, we would want to do that, assuming we had thought through the total equation and had a reward structure set up in this company C. Now, very important here when it comes to bill charge assessments. Now, I mentioned up front, one of the things that you find in most payer fee schedules and contracts is a clause that says the payer will pay the lesser the bill charge or the payer contracted rate. Well, this particular module, again, which is a snapshot out of our Revolution software, but you could, do it in a spreadsheet, however you do it, you want to know whether your bill charges are exceeding your contracted rates. If they're less than your contracted rates or payer allowables, that is a problem. So the reason it's a problem is because you'll get paid the bill charge and not the contracted rate, even though you may have negotiated a better contracted rate. So this little model here is just designed based on a set of parameters to detect underpayments on bill charges versus contracted rates. Of course, maybe a second theme here is that you're leaving some money on the table on an out-of-network basis because when you're dealing with out-of-network book of business, if your bill charge is set at a threshold that's too low, you're naturally leaving money on the table. If you bill at 80% of bill charges and your bill charges are less than what you intended them to be, in this case 250% of Medicare, then you leave money on the table too, which is what this possible upside is trying to demonstrate. But the point being that in all cases, the simple rule is you want to make sure that certainly that your bill charges, no matter what, exceed for any single code on any payer contract, your bill charge certainly needs to be higher than the contracted rate up for that code. So if you have 10 different payer contracts in place for code 59400, you would want to make sure that in every case, the bill charge of 2500 exceeded the contracted rate for that same code across every single contract. That's the key point. Okay. Just in the interest of time, I've given you enough on analytics. I'll just point out, and you can go through this when you get the slide deck, but this is just designed to make you go through the effort of dissecting these two codes and summing up the payer rates times the volumes divided by the Medicare rates times the volume to show you the weighted average. And if you were to just take the two average rates, the 90 and the 80, you would think it's 85, but when you do the weighted average technique below, you're going to find out that the calculation yields 82.5, which, as I pointed out before, is very typical in payer contracts where the codes that you care about the most, when you weight them properly, are going to show a lower yield than what the payer shows. So be careful, work with weighted averages. Now, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So let's talk about that for a moment. And this goes back to what I thought was an excellent question before. The payer has a standard fee schedule, or let's extend it to two cases. The payer has a standard fee schedule, won't increase it, and or the payer says, I can't get into the network, I'm a laboratory, I'm a DME company, I'm a dialysis provider, behavioral health organization, detox facility, etc. And the payer's saying, no go because I already have my network's closed. So what do I do? How do I go about doing the proper assessment where I can explain to the payer why they should either give me an increase or get me into the network? So a couple of things that are important here. One is going to be, remember who the customers are of the health insurance company. They are large employer groups. And if you are getting a lot of referrals in your area from those employers, then if you can, and you have a partnership with those employers and their HR departments, if need be, you can engage them in your discussion with the payer to say, look, I need your help to consider an increase for this practice. I need your help to get this DME company into the network because my employees are using their products, large numbers of them each year right now, and they're having to deal with out-of-network rates, and that's not what we want. So we need help. So engaging those employer groups, keeping track of the out-of-network book of business, the referral opportunities from employers and from hospital systems, large practices, depending on what kind of company you are. Those kinds of things are opportunities. Now, on the corresponding side of it, of course, are the threats. The merger. So maybe you're competing against, now you're a much smaller entity than other companies in your area, which means that the value that you bring to the table, the product, the service differentiation, those sorts of things, the value-based aspect to what you do is going to be very important. And if you can actually construct a contract that has a value-based component based on things that you do compared to the competition, that can be a differentiator. Even today, participation in certain product lines in certain states may be important. Maybe the payer is trying to build out, still it's they have an health insurance exchange, and they're wanting to build out the exchange product, or need more of a certain kind of company or practice on the exchange product, or maybe it's a Medicare Advantage product. So if you agree to certain rates on the Medicare Advantage product, then they'll put you into the PPO product line as well. So these things tend to play off each other and can be very important to the payer. I had not too long ago, a large practice in the Midwest that was dealing with a large health insurance company. And that large health insurance company was very much trying to, in that state, to build out its Medicare Advantage program. They essentially had one contract with rates for both product lines, the typical PPO product line and Medicare Advantage product line. And so if certain kinds of specialty practices were willing to sign on to both product lines, the PPO and the Medicare Advantage in that case, they were much more amenable to both increases as well as to inclusion in the network. So, this is really about, a famous president once said, ask not what the payer can do for you, but what you can do for the payer. So it's really about understanding this mindset of the payer. Obviously, I substituted payer for country there, but I think you knew that. But anyway, it really is about getting into the mentality of the payer, figuring out what it is the payer needs, and then what it is that you offer, and how is it different or better than what others that you're competing with might offer. So this is, before I go into the actual letter preparation, which is then going to take some of these concepts of differentiation and turn them into a heavy-hitting letter, I think this is an excellent point to move back into question and answer mode. I will, again, provide a second opportunity for live questions, so let me do that, and then we'll see if we have any. If not, it sounds like we're getting a lot in the question at Healthcents, so we'll move over to that vehicle. But let's start with live if we have any. Okay. So at this point, if you would like to ask a live question, just have at it, press *6 and ask your question. Okay, we have another shy group. We get that. A lot of people like to send them in. Okay, so Nicole, let's move over to you, and let's field some questions that have come in.
Okay, great. One of the new questions is, our group is an emergency physician group. Why do carriers think groups should be paid less if patient volume is low? Why isn't treating a patient as important, whether in large patient volume setting or small volume setting?
Well, it's dollars is the answer. I mean, a payer is going to, it's an economic, unfortunately, but reality is it's going to be based on dollars, which is a function of pricing and revenue. So volume times price is ultimately what yields revenue, and you sum up all the marbles of everything you're doing as an emergency clinic, an urgent care center. The larger ones are going to certainly, and this is going to be true for specialty practices as well, DME companies, ancillary providers, larger dollars, higher numbers of patients because of that scenario. It's a business. It's going to yield more weight. Okay. Next.
Okay, the next question is, in your experience, how important is it to follow the prescribed processes to get contracted?
Okay. Yeah, and this comes up a lot because interestingly, even after we sign clients on, and I'm sure, Nicole, you can relate to this, we have some clients that, they get very anxious. They want to move through those steps or skip steps, maybe start out by going to a senior VP of payer contracting, for example. In other words, moving right to the escalation phase rather than send a proposal to a first-level contracts negotiator and work their way up the chain. And while it may seem like more expeditious to skip steps, the steps are there for a reason, and that is that unless it's an exceptional scenario, we have found doing this, hundreds of thousands of times as a company, that sequencing of steps is what yields the best overall outcome. And part of the reason is, if you think about the scenario, like if you were to go to a senior VP and not start with a first-level contract negotiator, the typical reaction, we've tried that over the years, what happens is almost always the request is pushed back down. In fact, was asked just today, a company that we're dealing with, it's a large DME company with a certain kind of specialty product. They're very interested to get into a payers network, and you can probably figure out who it is, that covers 14 different states. And we've worked with that payer a bit and have helped differentiate a number of similar companies. But, I explained to the company and the account executive that we have working on it that it is best in that case to work through some of the relationships that we have in the interior states that are part of that network and get some success getting into those states first, and use that as an opportunity then to take it out across all the states. Because if we were to bypass that process and just go to the senior VP, who in this case, we do know and we've had success working with her before, the problem is that she will do what any good executive will do, is ask you if you have already talked to a person that works 3 levels below her about it, who's assigned to do this kind of contracting. And if your answer is no, then she'll push you back down right away to the first level negotiator. And in effect, you will have taken away your own opportunity inadvertently to be able to escalate and go up the chain back to her, because now she will have pushed you down and you've really taken away any negotiating leverage that you have. It may seem counterintuitive that that's the case, but that is the case, because pretty much the senior VPs will almost always say, well, have you talked to my first level negotiator? If your answer is no, we're coming to you because of a great proposal, they're going to say, go talk to the first level negotiator and work it through with them. So the point being that the steps are there to assure that you have the maximum leverage, and that if you follow those steps sequentially, which, again, goes back to the proper preparation to write this letter we're about to look at, pointing out the right differentiation, sending it to the first level person that you're negotiating with, and working your way up the chain. All those things are designed, by and large, to yield, what is a replicable, proven success formula, and we want you to be successful. Okay, so let's talk about now we've done our differentiation, and now we want to write a letter to a payer to get into the network or to request an increase. This applies to both. How do we do it? So the way we're going to do it is the following. First off, it's going to be a deductive rather than inductive letter. What do I mean by that? Deductive letters start with the reason, the conclusion, why it is you're writing to the payer. And then you back it up with information about your company or practice, and then you conclude it with making sure that you ask for a response in a short period of time, typically about 3 weeks out. That's the throwing the hook. And these letters are all going to be a maximum of about a page to a page and a half. We don't want it to be like the novel Moby Dick. We want it to be, brevity is king or queen here. We want to make sure to get to the point and get the payer's attention and ask for a response and then start to engage the payer. That's what we're trying to accomplish. So in this example, and I'll give you the actual letter. If you take the next few slides, you can customize it for your own situation. But this is the idea. Nicole will tell you that we always, in the first paragraph, state the purpose of why we're writing to the payer. In fact, I review all the letters that, a template for all the letters that go out. Obviously, if we're dealing with clients negotiating 40 contracts, I don't review 40 letters, but I review the one letter that's going to be customized for 40 different situations. And what I look for right away is in that first paragraph somewhere. In this case, it's the first sentence. That's great. But somewhere in the first paragraph is the reason we're writing. So we're writing on behalf of the company to initiate a renegotiation. So get to the point. That's what we're doing. All right, so the payer knows we're writing to them for that purpose. In this case, we focus on the attributes of value and quality, routinely performing surgical services in an office setting. Now, in this case, the angle is that there are certain office-based codes that can otherwise be performed. Those same services can be performed in a hospital, on an outpatient basis, or maybe even an ambulatory surgery center, which is certainly better from a payer perspective than the hospital due to the reduced cost, but it's not as good as the office setting where they're already paying for the physician service. So if we have flagged a number of codes, services that can be performed in office and rather than in a center of some type, that can yield a certain amount of savings. So, we pick what we call them headliners. In other words, what are the things of value to the payer that we want to emphasize? So that's where we start off here, is with with the reason we're writing and the headliner. Then we can get into what's unique. Do we have special products, special services, certain demonstrated outcomes that are better than others in our area? What are the things that we can bring to the table that others can't? And we just want 2 to 3 paragraphs, perhaps, with those items elaborated. And then we get to the finish line, which is, and this is interesting wording if you look closely at it, where we say that we remain committed to continuing to work with you and caring for your members. One might be cynical and say, what are we really saying there? Are we threatening to go out of network? Well, really not what we're doing. But we're perhaps intimating that in order to stay in the network, that we need to be able to do so at rates that are commensurate with the value that we're bringing to the table. So we emphasize that. And then we get to the point of right there in the last paragraph saying that we request your reply by a specific date. So the date is critical because you don't want that date to be more than roughly 3 weeks out. So definitely finish with the date. So and then we start following up like crazy with the payer right after we send the letter out. So this whole aspect of proposal letter, the construction of the letter, the approach is very critical. So with that, I'm going to pause and field a couple more questions. So Nicole, this time let's start with questions that have come in.
Okay, Steve. Let's see here. Why is it Why is weighted average reimbursement important to use versus averages or volumes alone?
Okay, thank you. So weighted average reimbursement is really a critical concept in negotiating payer contracts. You know, mention this up front in the context of the 20/80 rule, that 20% of the codes or services driving 80% of your revenue. So you want to make sure that you are honing in on the codes or services bottom line that drive the most revenue, and the way to do that is by using those weighted average calculations where you sum up the payer rates times the volumes of each code or service divided by the Medicare rates times the codes or volumes, or a similar metric, so that you come up with the true reimbursement for the code weighted to the importance of the revenue contribution of the code or service. So it's all about making sure that when you start driving fee schedules in a negotiation, that you're truly going to make more money handling the right codes or services in the negotiation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. We do have another one. After the initial preparation and the proposal letter is sent out, when and how often should we follow up with the payer, and how much time should we give them to respond?
Okay. Yeah, so that's a terrific one because, you know, there's a bit of a balance to it. I know some providers, you know, want instantaneous feedback and, you know, to get it right away and every day and that sort of thing. But so we have to do it in a way that is going to work well and not shut the payer down, where they feel like, you know, they're hearing from us, you know, 3 or 4 times a day, every day, and they say, you know, boy, we're not interested in working with this company. They're going to be really hard to work with. So usually our rule of thumb is, and this gets to, you know, what we're seeing here at the best practice 6, 7, and 8, the blocking and tackling phase, is you get the letter out, and what you do is maybe a day or two later, hey, you know, just checking in. Did you receive my letter? You know, we're looking forward to getting a reply a couple weeks out, and happy to answer any questions. So you probably want to do it once, a few days after you send the letter out, perhaps once or twice more during that 3-week period, just to keep the rapport or establish the relationship. And if you're not hearing from the payer as well, it's actually helping you to prepare for an escalation, because if you catalog, one of the things that we do is we keep track of these interactions in a database, and we keep track of the date and time and who, or, you know, the date, who we spoke to at the payer or didn't speak to, or who didn't reply, that sort of thing. So if you don't get, you know, engagement early, then that can be a reason a few weeks later then to say, you know, we've been trying to reach out to your payer contracts manager, haven't heard back, and so we're escalating this to you to get a reply. So that can be effective as well. And that's another reason why, you know, steady but reasonable follow-up is critical. All right. So let me move on to the topic of contract language. This is a very topic of high interest. I've given this actually webinars just on this topic alone. I have a whole section, an hour-and-a-half session on operational payer contract language as part of our blueprint course as well. So this, you know, this is a whole important topic. You know, that when you get into it thoroughly, it becomes its own. It branches out into its own topic with a whole host of related language constructs and issues. What I've done here is tried to pick out a few of the highlights for you for the purpose of today, and also, again, in the spirit of giving you something that you can take back home with you and use right away. These are some of the things that I would be very concerned about. They're not the only things by any means, or, you know, we wouldn't have an hour and a half session with, a template of 25 different things plus to look out for, but these are a few that certainly can bite very hard. So I've selected them as the top ones to cover today. I've mentioned the lesser bill charge versus payer contracted rates, and I'm going to mention it again because in my mind it's perhaps the most important of the bunch, because it's the one that can hinder your payments the most once you have a contract in place. And again, the idea here, or what's happening, is somewhere in the depths of your contracts, each one of them is going to be a construct that says the payer will pay you. It may say lesser bill charge versus contracted rate, may say the lesser of UCR versus allowable rate. That gets even more tricky because UCR is basically a term that's used to describe what might be commercially reasonable in a particular area in lieu of the bill charge, but the point is that there will be some variant of this language, and what you want to make sure of is that your bill charge, your charge master retail rates, the rates that you set for cash paying patients, is set well above your contracted rates for every agreement. And it's a good idea if they calibrate to Medicare to pick a standard. We find for medical practices that's often in the 250 to 300% range unless you're getting different advice from your CPA, and just calibrate all your rates to that level and compare all your codes and your charge master rates that are set right now in your billing system to that threshold to make sure that they cross over that threshold. So if you want them at 250% each and every code, that means that every code that's in your charge master should already be at that level or higher. And if they're not, the first thing you want to do is raise them up to that level. And you also want to pick a threshold that naturally is going to exceed your contracted rates, because that's ultimately what you're trying to protect against, is making sure that your bill charge exceeds the contracted rates for each and every code on each and every contract. So I would give that, top billing here, no pun intended. Now, timely filing requirements. So you often see claims-related timing in a payer contract. How long do I have to file a claim with the payer, and then how long does the payer have to pay it? I'd say that more often than not, I see something in the range of up to 90 days to file it, and then the payer, will pay it within 30 to 45 days of when you file it. So something like that, at least is in the, let's say it's consistent with what we see quite a bit. And then also be cognizant of primary and secondary insurance, because it will definitely be critical that the primary insurance is billed and the secondary insurance is billed sequentially to make sure that the claim is appropriately being paid. You wouldn't want to file a secondary claim before filing a primary claim and so forth. What about the payment for non-covered and unlisted services? Sometimes you look at a payer contract and it has the rates for your top codes, but it doesn't mention anything about, well, what about, new services or unlisted services? So usually what we try to do where possible is include a clause that stipulates for any unlisted codes that you'll get paid X% of your billed charges. That's a good way to do it, because then it, as long as you have the code covered somewhere in your charge master, then there's some defaulted payment that will cover it. 80% is a good number if you can make that happen. Term and termination notification requirements. Many payers standardize here, but that's going to go hand in glove with the term of the agreement. So we see several different ways that these agreements are constructed. I mentioned that some are what I would call evergreen, like an evergreen tree. They're going to keep growing every year unless somebody terminates it within a certain window each year. The ideal thing on term and termination is perhaps after the first year of the agreement to have a 90-day without cause clause where you can invoke that termination at any point with a 90-day notice. So, look for that for sure. Make sure you can live with whatever the term and termination notification requirements are, and they will definitely be somewhere. There will be a section, no doubt, that will probably have that exact title called term and termination or term something like that. You'll find it pretty easily. Does the payer have any pre-authorization requirements and making sure that your office staff can adhere to those verification requirements? Retrospective reviews, boy, this can be scary. I had a DME company one time that was retrospectively billed about $5 million. They were asked to refund about $5 million worth of services that were paid by the payer. Well, make sure that there's some limitation in the contract about how long a claim can be reviewed. And maybe it's, I've seen it be that payer has up to 6 months from the date that it's filed. That's probably okay, but you certainly don't want it to be 5 years later and then, suddenly there's some sort of ongoing mistake made and nobody realized it, and boom, you're now confronted with multi-millions of dollars of retrospective refunds. So be very careful of that. One that I didn't put here, but sort of along this vein, you don't see it so much now, but it's the so-called favored nation clause. And you say, what the heck's that? Well, the favored nation says that if you put an agreement in place with payer A, and let's just say it's at 100, I'll just pick a number out of thin air, it's at 120% of, local Medicare rates. And then 6 months later, you put an agreement with payer B at 100% of Medicare rates, same kind of fee schedule, except at 100%. Now, the payer A has the rights to lower your rates to 100%. In other words, they get the best or favored fee schedule of any fee schedule that's subsequently put in place. That's a really bad deal. You don't ever want to sign up for that. Now, I used to see that more frequently. It doesn't come up so much anymore. But if you ever see that, definitely I would circle it and highlight it and get it removed, because you don't ever want to, have to go back and lower a fee schedule that you've worked hard to negotiate and be responsible yet for telling the payer that you got a lower fee schedule in place or be liable for bad stuff. Third-party and silent PPOs, well, this is where if you have agreements in place where commercial payers are enrolled with various organizations where they pay claims, and these are lease networks, for example. You want to make sure to know the relations between these different organizations, because typically a payer is going to pick the lowest of the bunch and pay you that way. So make sure you understand how the puzzle pieces of your different contracts fit together and what you're really going to be paid. And it might seem like it goes without saying, but I feel like it's necessary to say, always have a legal review, because while some of these things, we understand as professionals that do payer contracting, there's a lot of things that only an attorney is going to understand when it comes to indemnification and insurance requirements, things like that might not meet the eye of even very skilled business people. So I always say it's a good idea to have a business expert and a legal expert look over every single contract. And last but not least, let's monitor our claims. This whole chart is all about making sure that you take a sample of a certain number of claims payments and detect cases where those claims are not being paid at contracted rates at 100%, including patient co-payments and co-insurance. And then you dig into the reasons why. Is it because your bill charge is set too low? Is it because the payer simply didn't pay the claim right? Let's get underneath the covers and figure it out. Closed and narrow networks, we've ended up touching on some of the topics since we're getting to the end of the road here. What I'm going to do is just hit on the salient points that I think we've touched on a little bit earlier as we've gone through other segments, and that is value differentiation. That's what it's about. Whether you're going after a contract increase or trying to get in a closed network, what we usually do, and I have a little sheet of paper that elaborates this for the clients that we bring on board, but the idea is that you pick on one or more of these value attributes as a company or practice, and when you build your value proposition, your proposal letter, you then elaborate the headliners that fit into this area. So it could be clinical benefits that we talked about leading to cost savings, product advantage, service advantage, geographic coverage, the referrals from payers, from hospital systems and employers. Those sorts of things are, value differentiators. So it doesn't mean you have to check every single box. That's not it at all. But what you want to do is pick at least one or more key value differentiators, because I think it was asked early on is, well, how can I break through a standard fee schedule? Or how can I get into a closed network? Well, this is going to be ultimately getting into the details of these differentiators is going to be how you do it. And also, as we discussed, if you have a large book of business that's coming from certain employers in particular, that's going to help you to differentiate your value. Is price a differentiator? Perhaps, but I would say in concert with one or more of these other value attributes. I've found very few cases where a payer will simply contract with a company or practice just because their prices are lower than another company's. They're usually looking for, value attributes that are going to, help them to improve their perceived service to their customers, namely their employer group. And then from here, we go through whole elaboration of the different strategies and so forth that can be used for value differentiation and the different payer types. So one other topic I'll just touch on slightly is value-based contracting. There are some agreements, PPO agreements, where a payer will give you about a 5% bonus above the fee-for-service structure if you meet certain metrics. So in this example, I took this from a couple of real contracts that we've seen fly by, efficiency, qualitative, quantitative metrics. So maybe you get a 2% bonus if you do generic drug utilization above a certain percentage, or preferred drug utilization. Maybe if you follow best practices and do an e-prescribe 100% of the time, you get another 2%. And if I only do in-network referrals, which is important to some payers, they want practices only referring to in-network labs and ASCs, that sort of thing. So they'll reward you another percent for that, so it might add up to 5%, or perhaps it's a patient SAT survey. So some combination of these characteristics. So it can be a good approach to maybe slightly increasing the reimbursement in your contracts if a payer is amenable or has a structure for doing a value-based component in it on top of your fee-for-service. So wrapping that whole thing up, what do we do if a payer tells us that the network's closed? What's my best recourse? Well, this might be tempting. Pack your bags and take the next plane to Honolulu. Let's go. Explain and emphasize your value proposition to the negotiator and ask them to arrange a meeting with you. and or supervisor, that would be the way to go. Remember, you don't want to send a letter to the VP of contracting until you tried to work it out at the lower levels. That's really what I'm trying to get across here, and to focus on value. Obviously, you wouldn't want to go higher than the VP and go to the president for all the reasons we talked about earlier. So clearly, item B is all right. Not too much time, unfortunately, to talk about trends and directions and so forth. So let me wrap it up here and be respectful of everybody's time. One other couple points in closing. First is my partner is offering up free contracts assessments, and all you need to do is email her or phone her directly. And it's a half-hour assessment. It's available to any product or service company, including practices, ASCs, DME companies, and ancillary providers. No consultants, please. But it is a half-hour assessment, and she'll, in that time, discuss with you your needs and give you some advice and let you know if there's a way we can help, or at the minimum send you on your way so you can help yourself to make some more money on your contracts. And if you have any questions at all or would like to correspond with me, you can email me at info@healthcents.com or phone me directly at the number that's up on the screen. And furthermore, starting right now, if you go to healthcents.com/10best2019, you will be able to get copies of these slides right away. And at this moment, you'll also, if you go to that link, you'll be able to get a earlier version of this same webinar. But if you wait till tomorrow morning, you'll also get this actual version that we went through today. So I know we're a couple minutes over. I'll take a final question or two, Nicole, if we have any that are teed up.
Okay, yeah, Steve, we do have one. If Healthcents is working to negotiate a contract for a provider, do you have someone to perform the legal review of the contract, or should the client have the legal review performed after the initial negotiated contract is received, or do you wait until you have the final contract before signing?
Yeah, good question. Well, first off, to answer the question, we are not legal counsel. We don't have legal counsel to review contracts, so it is best that your own healthcare attorney review contracts. Now, if you don't have one, you want a referral, because we've been doing this a long time. I know of a few really good legal counsel healthcare attorneys that I can refer you to. I've done that for a number of our clients, but you should have a separate, distinct legal review, separate from any business assessment that we or anyone else would do for your contract. And as far as the timing, just to save the manpower, get as far as you can to get to a final version of the contract before you hand it over to the legal counsel, because they tend to have pretty high hourly rates. Okay, I'm going to open the lines once more just to give everybody who's hung in here a last opportunity if you'd like to ask any direct questions before we wrap up. So okay, if you'd like to ask a final question, please press *6 and ask your question. Okay, then we will consider this a wrap, and thank you very much for attending 10 Best Payer Contracting Practices of 2019, and best of luck negotiating your payer contracts. This webinar is concluded.